So recently there's been some speculation about a certain questionnaire that talks about the potential future for a true Classic Plus, as well as the imminent release of the War Within for retail World of Warcraft. And whilst Cataclysm might be going steady at the moment, the hype for Season of Discovery and Phase 4 seems to have dwindled somewhat, whilst hype for retail WoW with the War Within and the new World Soul Saga continues to go on the rise. And much like a guy at a party who has outstayed his welcome, as he begins to glance towards the acoustic guitar and ask if anyone wants to hear him play Wonderwall, the progression of expansions and future of Classic WoW in general is beginning to feel a bit aimless and uncertain, with arguments over how far the progression of expansions should go. As for many people, Cataclysm's release was already too far past the original trilogy, and with no era servers for Burning Crusade or Wrath in sight, it's worth taking a look at where the progression of expansions for Classic WoW should actually end. So let's dive in. To start, I think it's worth throwing it right back to 2019 when we first headed into Classic Vanilla WoW, and Classic was a brand spanking and shining new attraction for a lot of players, as retail WoW was kind of in the gutter with Battle for Azeroth, and especially as time progressed into Shadowlands. And at Vanilla's release it did feel like, relatively due to its success, that we'd probably head into Burning Crusade, as well as hope that built for Wrath of the Lich King, and well, that's just what happened, as looking back we see these as an original trilogy for World of Warcraft due to mainly taking place in the old world, and building on the already existing talent trees. However, combined with several changes that Wrath made alongside the major upheaval that Cataclysm then brought, most people do tend to see the cutoff for what you maybe consider Classic WoW to be the end of Wrath of the Lich King. Hence why the announcement for Cataclysm divided a lot of Classic players, seeing a lot of existing players instantly quit mid Icecrown Citadel as they saw no future in Classic WoW anymore. Sprinkle this with the fact that Dragonflight also managed to pull off a miracle in retail WoW and recover it back to a healthy state unbelievably, alongside the announcement of the promising World Soul Saga. Classic didn't quite have the same pull that it once had after its initial release. However, I'd argue that now it does seem like the door has been opened to a longer progression of expansions, due to mainly Cataclysm Classic's release, and well, to be honest, how surprisingly well Cataclysm has actually been received now that the expansion is up and running. I mean, there were issues within the pre-patch in some ways and other teething issues, but generally speaking, the build up to the expansion seemed to be way more negative than the actual ongoing experience of the expansion. And even as someone who didn't enjoy Cataclysm 14 years ago, I've actually kind of enjoyed it this time around, yet there isn't the same intensity of interest in Cataclysm compared to Wrath, BC or Vanilla, and I have zero motivation to level up any alts in Cataclysm either, so it's not quite the same vibe that you get from the original trilogy either though, which is why Season of Discovery and various projects based in Vanilla such as the Fresh Server movement organised by players themselves tend to be very popular, alongside a consistent shout for era servers for Wrath and Burning Crusade, as there is a yearn for a lot of Classic players who do want to play a version of WoW that is stapled somewhere within the original trilogy, as it feels like a home base to return to. And now as a result we have these issues and ambiguity surrounding Classic WoW, of how far are we taking this thing. The argument could be made that a lot of these expansions are now Classic due to how old they are. I mean, Cataclysm is 14 years old, it's not exactly a spring chicken anymore, and once you've opened Pandora's box it's hard to stop any justification for continuing to release expansions. I mean, there will be enough support for Mists of Pandaria for sure, and especially a chunk of support for Legion, with Legion potentially being the first expansion that a lot of retail players who probably started there would actually come back to try out. Yet we have the hump of Warlords of Draenor logged in the middle there, which could be a bit of a tough sell to players. But if expansions are released as a passive interest, with the big carrot on the stick being Mists of Pandaria and Legion, I'd assume they'd somewhat be able to justify having to release Warlords of Draenor along the way also, and in many ways maybe it does make sense to continue up to Legion, which felt like a significant end to one of WoW's big storylines, after the full frontal Legion invasion of Azeroth, and spoiler alert, Sargeras then stabbing Azeroth and being beamed away by a big laser ship. And it's also arguable that the War Within, which is starting this new phase for World of Warcraft, is picking up where Legion ended, so maybe there is an overarching idea introduced into the Classic expansion progression, that you're reliving the old story in the World of Warcraft storyline that builds up to the new WoW storyline in the World Soul Saga for retail, and this is your way of seeing how things came to be. Yet this really comes down to how much interest they'd be able to drum up for releasing some of these expansions now, and once again after Cataclysm's release I think you can probably slap the label of Classic WoW on any expansion now, except maybe for Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands onwards, as I'm pretty sure even Blizzard wants you to forget that Shadowlands happened at this point. But when Classic was released, the initial charm of it was re-experiencing these early expansions, but it certainly feels like the goalposts have moved in this time, and unfortunately the Classic team has backed themselves into a bit of a corner now, and the Classic team stayed stated that with Season of Discovery they're attempting to prove themselves, and that there would be a worthwhile long-term project to build here to Blizzard. And to be honest, I think they've done that enough to prove there is interest in mainly vanilla WoW, and an adapted version of vanilla WoW with new content. As for all of Season of Discovery's faults, you can't deny that there is a demand for this kind of game mode somewhere, maybe just without some of the stranger decisions that Season of Discovery made. But in that demand, the demand too continues for BC and Wrath era servers, which in my opinion need to be set up in the same way that we have vanilla servers, as a baseline for players to return to during the low tide of new content. For example, I will always return to play Diablo 2 when there's not much new content around for other games, and I do the same for BC or Wrath era servers also. So I don't agree that era servers would split the player base, as realistically you can't split players that just cancel their subscription when they have no interest in playing. But in this you can argue that the overall aim of Classic WoW shouldn't be focused on the progression of expansions anymore, and that these resources should be directed into a few era servers, but mainly for developing new projects within vanilla WoW that do have a true long-term potential for the lifespan of Classic. And if you just keep releasing expansions but at the rapid rate that Classic is doing, I mean with Cataclysm barely getting a year, you're going to be heading into Dragonflight Classic before you know it, with the majority of Classic players wondering what on earth is even going on now. Overall, I think if the train has left the station at this point, heading up to Legion could be a sensible enough plan, as enough people will want Mists and Legion, with Legion being the carrot on the stick to get people to go through WoD again. But once again, spoiler alert, Sargar is stabbing Azeroth with the huge sword is where we're picking up in the War Within for this new phase in the World Soul Saga. So developing Classic as a new idea to see the story that led up to that could make sense for the next few years whilst the World Soul Saga is going on. Personally for me, I don't really care what they do when it comes to releasing old expansions now. They could stop tomorrow and I'd be happy enough. For me, I want some era realms for Burning Crusade and Wrath setup, alongside the Classic team to mainly focus on developing new game modes like Season of Discovery but better, or a long-term Classic Plus project, as I'm not really yearning to see Mop, Warlords or Legion again if I'm entirely honest. Yet if I'm also entirely honest, I'd probably play through them again if they were on offer, but I'd rather focus went into developing Classic for the long term, rather than just re-releasing expansions where interest will continue to dwindle, that will be taking away from resources that could go towards new projects. And ultimately, I have the luxury of enjoying both retail and Classic, and the World Soul Saga with the War Within coming out soon is what's taking my interest at the moment. But unfortunately, there are a lot of players out there who just feel somewhat neglected at this point, so I'm hoping some big decisions are made on this way for the next few years to give a clearer path of where Classic is actually going. As someone who mainly makes videos about Classic with a sprinkle of retail in there, even I'm kind of struggling what to say about Classic at the moment. Unlike retail, which has now done a 180 and seems to have a lot going for it and a buzz around it for the first time in years. So do let me know what you think. Where should Classic WoW end its progression of expansions, or what really should be the next long-term aim of the game? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. Yet as always, take care out there, and I'll see you on the next one. As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.